Hey guys, my name is Anthony, and in today's video I'm going to be teaching you what you need to do to convert a dry setup into a setup built for wet conditions. So if you want to see more videos similar to this, make sure to click the link at the top right hand side of the screen or the link in the description after you finish watching this video to go to my playlist of all the F1 2020 tips that I have made thus far. So getting straight into the video, what exactly makes a good wet setup? Well, there are a few settings within the setup that changes the setup from being a good dry setup to being able to be quick in wet conditions. And those things are higher downforce. When it comes to your aero in F1 2020, you need a little bit more front aero to get the car turned into the corners than you would in the previous game. And obviously you need some rear aero so that you can get better stability throughout the corners and you can get better traction on exit. So when it comes to wet conditions, you'll need just a little bit more aero so that you can really get the car turned in and you can really get that traction down in wet conditions, obviously with it being a lot more difficult. In addition to that, you need to have a low on throttle, which you would usually have in dry setups on F1 2020 anyway, but you still will need a low on throttle differential. In addition to that, you will also need softer suspension so that you can ride on the curbs going into corners a little bit more aggressively. Obviously in wet conditions, it's still quite difficult to use all of the curb that you would in dry conditions. However, the softer suspensions you have, then the better chance you'll have of being able to use more of the curbs going into certain corners. You'll also need to adjust your ride height, making it higher to keep the bottom of your car off of the water sitting on the track. You'll also need lower brake pressures. Well, actually, you don't really need lower brake pressures. However, if you want to keep things simple, you can lower your brake pressures. And then if you're using some tire pressures, you would want to lower those as well. But usually in F1 2020, you'd be using minimum tire pressures anyway. So moving on to the last part of the video now, which is what you need to change from your dry setup in order to make it better in wet conditions. So moving on to the aerodynamics, obviously your aero depends on what track you're on and how much downforce you need on the track. However, it can also depend on how much water is sitting on the track, aka how heavy it's going to be raining throughout the race. If it's intermediate conditions, then you only really need to make slight adjustments, maybe just increase the front aero by 1 and then increase the rear aero by 2. However, if it's going to be full wet conditions, then you will need to adjust it a little bit more, maybe adding 2 front aero or potentially even 3 front aero to the car, and then you would need to add enough rear aero to match the front aero. So if you're using, for example, 7 front aero in full wet conditions, then you would need to use maybe at least 10 at the rear so that your rear of the car can still be stable throughout the corners and stable when getting traction down on exits. So the next thing that you need to think about changing is your differential. Now, as I said earlier on in the video, you don't need to worry about your on throttle differential because you're already going to have that set to 50% even in dry conditions. So your on throttle, you don't need to worry about that. No changes need to be made there. However, for your off throttle, that's where some changes may need to be made. If you're using 50% to say 55% on the off throttle, then you may need to increase it potentially even by 5% up to 60%. However, if you're already using 60%, you probably could add more to it and see if it feels better for you. However, I wouldn't recommend increasing it by that much because 60% is a pretty good place to have it when in wet conditions. So moving on to the suspension geometry, and I usually don't change anything here because you can use right, left, and you'll be good in both dry conditions and in wet conditions. However, if you have spent the time tweaking your suspension geometry, then maybe you can make a few changes depending on how the car feels. If you feel as if the car's turning too much into the corner, then maybe you can decrease your minimum toe, or if you feel as if the car's not turning in enough, then you can increase the minimum toe until the car's turning in exactly how you want it. But usually you would just use right, left on F1 2020 and you'd be good in both fully dry conditions and fully wet conditions. So your suspension settings is probably going to be the most crucial part of your setup. It can make or it can break your setup. So I wanted to get an expert in who knew a lot more than I did when it comes to setups to get his second opinion and see exactly what he would change when converting a dry setup to a wet setup. So I got Ethan, who's better known as Revo, who, if you don't know who he is, he's currently the development driver for Alfa Romeo. So I'm going to read what he had to say. I would say for the suspension, you would generally go for a stiffer roll bar and keep them closer together to keep the car stable, especially in high speed corners. The roll bar that are set too far apart makes the car very oversteery mid corner in wet conditions, so you sometimes might need to add a small amount of ride height as well. I find that in this game, wet compounds increase the ride height already, but if you really want more stability, then I would increase your ride height slightly. Suspension stiffness, I don't really change that too much, and for the geometry, you'd probably add a bit of extra rear camber simply to keep the car stable as well. So as I said, for the suspension geometry, you usually wouldn't change it because right, left is definitely a great baseline to start with, but as you can see, Revo did say that you can add some rear camber to the car as well, just to keep the car a little bit more stable through those corners. So make sure to go on Twitter and follow Revo if you don't already. A link will be in the description, and thank you Revo for getting back to me as quickly as you did. And lastly, we're going to be doing brakes and tires at the same time because there's not really much you need to change to these two sections. You can lower the brake pressure if you want to keep things a little bit more simple, but on F1 2020 you really don't need to do that. So you can keep it at 100% brake pressure and 50% front brake bias. And then moving on to your tires now, if you are using some tire pressures in dry conditions, make sure to keep that at minimum in wet conditions. However, usually nowadays people tend to use minimum tire pressures no matter what conditions they're in. So now you guys know exactly what you need to do to convert a dry setup into a wet setup. However, I know that for a lot of you, that's not the most difficult part when it comes to F1 2020. The most difficult part is probably how to drive without assists. So I've already made a video on how to drive without assist, how to drive quick without assists, so you can watch that by clicking the link at the top right hand side of the screen, or waiting until the video ends and clicking one of the videos on the end card. So that's going to be the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to hit the like button and stick around by subscribing to the channel. We hit 4K subscribers over the course of me not uploading throughout this month, so I want to thank you very much for the support that you guys have shown me this year on the channel, and I hope to continue doing what I've been doing going into next year and even pumping out better content for you guys. So I'll see you lot in the next video.